Francisco, I spent my days billing hours at the law firm, and I spent my nights co-founding an organization called Spark. We have a lot of Spark representatives here tonight. And it was amazing. Spark is designed to engage young people in gender equality issues. In the beginning, 15 years ago, we had huge buzz. We had lines around the block. We had our revenue was doubling every single month. And then, despite all of these efforts, we hit a wall. Like 2/3 of the organizations in this country, we couldn't get more than $500,000 in our coffers to grow our impact. We got stuck despite all of our efforts. And so I became really curious around this same time, living in the Silicon Valley, as we saw all these organizations exploding around us. Kiva was started same month as Spark in 2004. And then Jessica Jackley and Matt Flannery were on Oprah, and overnight they raised $11 million and broke their servers, their crowdfunding site. And so I became really curious, who are these organizations? How are they doing it? How are they growing their impact to scale, to meet the needs that we're facing today? And so I have spent the past 5 years surveying hundreds of social entrepreneurs, sitting down and interviewing 100 social entrepreneurs around the country, their staff, their funders, their beneficiaries, all to get to the bottom of this single question. Why is it that some organizations succeed and scale and others don't? So social startup success is the playbook that I wish we had when we co-founded Spark 15 years ago. It's the playbook that my students at Stanford have been asking for years. And it's an insider's look at the 5 best practices of the top performing nonprofits around the United States. And my hope is that readers will come away with a really strong sense of what it takes to make a difference. So if you're a donor and you're looking to make better choices about where you're donating your money, if you're a board member and you want to do a better job of supporting an organization, if you are thinking of starting a nonprofit, or if you've started a nonprofit and you want to scale your growth, social startup success is for you. The problems that we're facing in this world are huge. Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, who's often called the godfather of social entrepreneurship, is fond of saying that it's no longer enough to give a man a fish or even to teach a man a fish, that we have to revolutionize the fishing industry. And that's just what social entrepreneurs are doing. They're working really hard, not just to ensure that a homeless person has a meal or a bed, but they're working to solve the problems that are causing that person to be homeless in the first place. And I am so excited tonight to have 3 social entrepreneurs here to have a lively conversation with us about their work and about the incredible insights that they provided me and the stories that they talk about, which are featured in Social Startup Success. So I will invite our panelists up on stage. So a social entrepreneur is anyone who uses innovation to solve a social problem. I define scale in social startup success as anyone who can break past that $500,000 revenue mark that I mentioned before. Cheryl Dorsey, Charles Best, and Jessamyn Rodriguez truly represent some of the most innovative thinking and problem solving that this city and this world has to offer. And I am truly grateful to have them here on stage tonight. So I'm going to start by asking each one of them to tell a brief personal story about their work, and then we'll have some Q&A and questions from the audience at the end. Cheryl, do you want to start?
Good evening, everyone. Oh, I need to use this. Okay. Is this better? Good evening, everyone. My name is Cheryl Dorsey. I run an organization called Echoing Green. Kathleen, thank you so much for inviting Echoing Green to attend tonight. I think the work that you have put out through Social Startup Success is really critical for the field. I remember a number of years ago when two Echoing Green alums, Heather McLeod Grant and Leslie Crutchfield, put out Forces for Good, which looked at the best practices of top performing nonprofits. But looking at later stage organizations, a very aspirational book. But the work that you've done and all the research, all the interviews, and boiling it down into these 5 practices, it's just a real user's guide for practitioners who are in the field, just starting out. And I just can't tell you how proud I am of you and how vital this is as a tool for the social entrepreneurial space. So congratulations and thank you for your contribution, very important contribution to the work of social innovation. I've been in this space a very long time. I've been running Echoing Green for the past 16 years, but was an Echoing Green Fellow 25 years ago. Unbelievable. And in some ways, this past week was very much of an anniversary for me personally, because on January 15th, 1992, the organization that I helped launch, the Family Van, hit the streets of Boston on Martin Luther King Day 25 years ago, and we were looking at the difference in infant mortality rates between black and white babies in inner city Boston. And I wouldn't be here today, and the Family Van would not be on the road without Echoing Green, which really was a transformative catalyst for my development as a young leader. And all of the things that I didn't know and all of the times that I stumbled and could have used a book like Social Startup Success sort of forged sort of my pathway and got me to where I am today. And I do deeply believe for these incredible social innovators that I had the honor of being with on the stage are part and parcel of a bona fide global social movement. And in a day, in a moment in time when there's so much sort of populist dust up and rage and anger, the work that you all do and what you represent as social innovation leaders is really the flip side of that populist rage. It's like, what can we do instead of blowing it all up? It's how do we fix it collectively? So I deeply believe in this work and this movement, but we need practical tools and tips. And again, I think that's what Social Startup Success offers. And I think you guys are going to learn a lot from these folks as they share a little bit more about their journey. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, +1 to all of Cheryl's gratitude to you, Kathleen, and gratitude to Cheryl, who was on the board of directors of DonorsChoose.org during our formative years. We started 18 years ago. I was a history teacher at a public high school in the Bronx, and during my first year of teaching, my colleagues and I were spending a lot of our own money on copy paper and pencils, and then we would talk in the teacher's lunchroom about books that we wanted our students to read, and a field trip that we wanted to take them on, and art supplies that we needed for an art project. And this was years and years before crowdfunding was even a word, but I just kind of, it just stood to reason that there were people out there who'd want to help teachers like us if they could see exactly where their money was going. So my students helped me to create this website where public school teachers create classroom project requests and donors can choose the projects they want to support. I didn't know how to write a business plan. I didn't have any sort of broader view of the sector or how we could one day scale. Our ambition actually did not extend beyond New York City borders. We just wanted any New York City public school teacher to get the resources they needed for their kids, to be able to bring to life their best ideas for making learning fun. And we didn't have ambition beyond that. In fact, I was teaching a class, a student-run virtual business. It's called Virtual Enterprise. And one day I had to teach my students how to write a business plan, which I had no idea how to do. So I crammed the night before, and then I guess was semi-capable of teaching students how to write a business plan. And then that night, I was able to write the first business plan for DonorsChoose.org, which is like the reverse order of how that's supposed to happen, but one more testament to the need for your book.
Yeah, and so it's so impressive to think about interviewing 100 social entrepreneurs and then all of the ecosystem of support that goes into it. And I have to say, you know, we probably met, I guess, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, and I learned so much through that interview. And so I haven't, full disclosure, had a chance to read the book yet. I'm sure many of you haven't because just out. But I really could tell from the quality of the interview, the quality of knowledge that's going to be in the book. And I think this is also another interesting story. I sat there in awe because at that point you had a newborn, and I had I sold a cookbook 9 months pregnant, and then had to deliver the manuscript of the book when my son turned 1. He's now 4, and so I feel like there's a real I know what it meant to have tiny children and write that book, and so much respect for that.
Thank you, Ted, my husband.
Yeah, and what in the ecosystem of the household that it takes, because my cookbook would not be out there without a great husband that made that happen. But it's hard and emotional work, and very different than being an entrepreneur. And so Hot Bread Kitchen is a social enterprise. We wouldn't be here without Echoing Green and all of the amazing leaders in the social enterprise space that really supported what we did and do. What we exist to do is help individuals with culinary talent, people who have great recipes and great knowledge about cooking, but maybe not the resources to start businesses, start food businesses and launch careers in the culinary industry. And we do that through a very delicious medium, which is bread. And so Echoing Green was our first institutional funder in 2008, and we have grown a national bakery that distributes bread across the country. We bake everything in East Harlem, just up here, and we train women from around the world how to become bakers. So I call it the United Nations of Bread, and we exist up there in East Harlem. And I had the idea very early on in my career, probably a decade before I launched it. I interviewed for a job at Women's World Banking, but somebody heard Women's World Baking, and that idea of an immigrant women's baking collective, again, like not focused on global bakery domination, which is now my life aspiration, but focused on bringing together, and I think solving an important market opportunity, great international bread, with a social opportunity, helping women who had that talent leverage it. And that very early on, before social impact was talked about, before social enterprise was a term, and I tabled it and waited and built my career in other areas and went to graduate school thinking that I was going to work in public policy, and then kind of really at the moment in 2008, when I think social enterprise was much more coming into vogue, decided to really give it a go. And I also think, had the book been there when I first had the idea, that, I probably would have given it a go. And all of the, that decade where I sat on that idea, all of those women that I could have trained had we done it sooner. So it's really, leads to impact. So thank you.
Well, everyone should visit Hot Bread Kitchen, and I will attest to the fact that if all of my 100 interviews ended with delicious avocado toast on pepita bread, I would have been in trouble. So I want to start, Charles, with a question for you about measuring impact, because this is really, I think, a hallmark of this next wave of social change work. That my research showed that the organizations that tended to scale more quickly were more likely to say that they began measuring their impact from the very start, from day one. And that makes sense, because those are the organizations that are able to go out and tell donors about the work that they're doing in real hard terms. But it's also important because those are the organizations that are able to really look at their data and figure out not just how to prove what they're doing is working, but how to improve what they're doing and to tweak their model as they grow. The problem is that social entrepreneurs go into this work because they care about causes, not because they're data scientists. And so as a result, we have a sector where 75% of nonprofits say that they measure their impact and they collect data. Only 6% of those organizations believe that they're making good use of that data. So I would be curious to hear, now that you're coming on funding your millionth project, which is amazing, Donors Choose, how do you think about those numbers, and how do you dive beyond just vanity metrics? Like, how do you think about the true long-term impact of your work at Donors Choose?
Well, we hope that we can take the impact data that we capture and use it to have to achieve a whole new dimension of impact on the education system itself. But first, in spirit of humility, let me acknowledge that to this day, we struggle to isolate the impact of a funded classroom project on end-of-year student test scores, because our site self-selects for the most awesome, passionate teachers who are frustrated by the status quo, want their kids to have more, are willing to spend an hour outside of their working hours creating this project, telling the world about what they want for their students. And it's tough for us actually to disaggregate the impact of the project from the teachers' self-selecting awesomeness on end-of-year student test scores. And for some funders, that's the holy grail that we need to hit to be eligible for their funding. We do think that we can prove that getting a project funded through our site helps keep a teacher in the classroom longer. And we think we can demonstrate that the teachers who use our site are indeed the best teachers in the system. So when you're supporting one of their projects, you're supporting the best idea of one of the system's best teachers and helping to keep them in the classroom. But in any case, where we think we can use our impact data to achieve a whole new dimension is by opening up all of the data captured by every project on our site, which includes everything from the latitude and longitude of the school to the poverty rate, to the percentage of students who are from military families, those who speak English as a second language, the essay that the teacher wrote, which can be mined for recurring words and themes, every piece of information about every item requested by the teacher, down to the book title and ISBN number. We've opened up all that data, and now that we're at 1 million classroom projects funded, that data that we've opened up at data.donorschoose.org has statistical significance for which books middle school teachers in low-income communities think are most effective at getting kids hooked on reading. What technology devices do high school teachers in Louisiana most need, as expressed by the projects that they're creating on our site? The dream is not just to be able to point to the $600 million of giving to classroom projects on our site cumulatively, but to be able to point to billions of dollars of government education spending that's become smarter, better targeted, more responsive, because policymakers and budget makers can now listen to classroom teachers and hear what they're trying to tell the powers that be in the projects that they're creating on our site about what resources are most needed, what topics are trending. I'll end with just a data point of one. In Flint, Michigan, months and months before any city or state official had flagged the water crisis, there was a teacher on our site creating a project saying, I don't trust the water I see coming out of the faucets. My project is requesting bottled water. It was early enough in this crisis that the school principal emailed us 3 weeks later asking us to take down the project because it was embarrassing to the city of Flint that a teacher would not trust the local water supply. But in any case, a data point of one suggesting that we could do well to listen to classroom teachers and hear what they're trying to tell us in the projects that they're creating, such that impact data in and of itself could be a lever for further impact.
Yes. I think it's really interesting, Charles, how you really, first of all, kind of funnel, starting with the million and then, funnel it down to 2 to 3 metrics, which is what I recommend in social startup success. Don't feel like you have to measure everything. Pick the things that matter, down to the story, because it really is this kind of combination of really understanding both the breadth and the depth of the impact. And I'm sure this is true for you too at Hot Bread Kitchen. I mean, I'm sure 1 million women served would be an amazing metric for you to look at one day. You will. But at the same time, you're going deep with the women that you do serve. And so tell me a little bit about how you think about the metrics that you track and sort of how that how those resonate with donors and how you deal with donors who are asking you where is your impact?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I think it's an interesting comparison. So so we run a workforce development program, and then we run a business development. We have an incubator in the program. And so I think the workforce development is pretty simple. We take incoming wage data, 65% of the women coming into the program were unemployed in the previous year. Almost all were underemployed and have very low wages. And then we measure them a year out post-graduation, and we see at least a 300% wage boost for women that did have income reported in the previous year. And 90% of the women that come through the training program are still in their job a year out. Those are easily comparable numbers. There's obviously a lot of money, a lot of public money, a lot of private money that goes into workforce development. And for me, it is a very easily measurable. It's easily, the impact is easily measurable. I'm excited. It's a relatively new program. We only have, a relatively small group of women out, and I'm really interested to see what that means at 10 years, the impact on household income, what that means at 25 years on household income. And I'd love to have the resources to be able to do a longitudinal study and understand what that means for their families and their communities. That's the hard work that needs to happen in terms of what funders look at from workforce development. Fortunately, it tends to be really like retention rates and wage increase. So that was the first program we started. Then about 4 years later, a lot of the women coming into the training program who had talent and passion in the culinary arts were self-identifying as entrepreneurial, that like they wanted to, when they graduated, start food businesses. So in 2011, we started a culinary incubator, which is 9 rentable kitchen spaces. The most important asset that we provide is access to a kitchen space. We're sort of this proxy for capital in the early startup years of the risky years of food business. And then we provide business support. And entrepreneurs spend between 2 and 3 years in that program and then graduate out into brick and mortar or other outcomes. The metrics on that program are very, very difficult. And when I started it, the kind of shorthand for what I thought we were going to do in that program is help the woman who sells tamales on 116th Street, we're in El Barrio in East Harlem, help that woman formalize her business and get her tamale into Whole Foods. That's what I stated as the mission. And so if that was the mission of the program, what we would want to really see is business and growth of those businesses and how much income was going back to the household. The reality of it is that program is open to all sorts of entrepreneurs, and we have not year over year seen the growth of those low-income entrepreneurs, of their businesses, pace with the fully funded, the unsubsidized members coming into the incubator. And so we've changed and really are asking ourselves some tough questions around that metrics, wondering if the business income growth is the important metric or whether it's job creation. And if the ultimate goal of that program, the bigger impact that we've had, especially in East Harlem, a community where there's high unemployment, is the bigger impact of that program really around, just net job creation and good jobs created in East Harlem. And that is sort of an ongoing debate of the board and of my staff as well. And so we continue to track all of it, but it's what you do with it in the end that I think is going to be really telling.
And I notice that it changes as year after year. Cheryl, so many of the fellows that you support won't see impact in their work for years, if not decades. I'm on the board of an organization called Accountability Council that is fighting for policy work that will literally take decades to show impact. So what do you advise your fellows who don't necessarily have these beautiful metrics to present to funders? And do you see that those organizations have a harder time getting funded as a result?
Sure. I'll give a couple of points for both fellows and funders, because I think this is a really important conversation. And I often will talk about it in terms of sort of the measurement trap. I mean, again, for an organization like Echoing Green, who comes at social innovation through the lens of social justice, a lot of what we're doing, including funding terrific social entrepreneurs like Natalie Bridgman-Fields, who runs Accountability Council, is that these are social movement leaders. And this is long-term work. And the mantra is true that not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that can be measured matters. That is a particular truism when it comes to long-term normative social change, which is the stuff of social movement. So that's one difficulty. Also, when you're thinking about some social innovators that are really in the business of disruptive social change, these are new business models. So there's not necessarily a framework or a metric to point to. 15 years ago, when we invested in the Transgender Law Center, the first transgender law center in California, if not the country, how do you get your arms around that in the short term? I think there's also the practical consideration for newer social enterprises, the onerous nature of putting in place some of these metrics. You see it particularly in impact investing with systems such as IRIS, which is an impact metric system, which for us, a lot of our fellows, it was just too heavy and too much in terms of the rigor required and the standardization that was required to use the IRIS metrics. Didn't make sense for our very early stage folks. And then I think last but not least, and you use the word proxy, Jessamyn, metrics is sort of a proxy measure for robust organizational cultures. I think Mario Marino, who runs Leap of Reason Initiative, is so smart about this. It's what we're really trying to get to most of the time when we're looking at these metrics is how do you build a high performance culture like Charles has built at Donors Choose? How do you think about continuous improvement as important feedback loops for getting better that all the best social innovators do? That's what you're really trying to do. So instead of getting sort of obsessed and focused on the particular metric, it's why you are using it in the first place. So those are just some foundational things to keep in mind as we're working with these social enterprises.
Yeah, that proxy is a really, really important concept that I talk about in social startup success, if anyone wants to learn more. So I think this lends itself in a really interesting way to a conversation about earned income as well. So I know, Jessamyn, this is something that a tension that you have grappled with. Initially, you thought of the organization as having the potential to be fully sustainable from the revenue from the cafe and the and from the incubator. And as good as that pepita bread is, it can only fund so much of your programs. And so I would love to hear a little bit about this tension that you face in thinking about how to stay mission driven and serve the neediest women. And also try to sustain the programs with earned revenue.
So it's complicated. It's a really complicated question. So when I started Hot Bread Kitchen, I was equally driven to build a bakery business as I was to create a mission-oriented organization. I really came into it from a quite agnostic position where I was like, the mission is as important, but I'm an entrepreneur and believed that there was an opportunity for the market. And in the early modeling, it suggested that the margins in bread would start to cover impact pretty quickly. And so we grew the business, and it's a big small business. We do 150 deliveries a day. We do all the chopped croutons for Chopped. We do the bread for JetBlue. We've got some big corporate customers, and the impact has been quite significant. And up until now, we've grown it sort of under the auspices of the nonprofit, really having made the decision early on that the training program was going to be integral to how that bakery would grow. And we sort of got to a certain scale and, realized that ultimately for both to thrive and be successful, both had to be properly capitalized and operate for, the model in an optimal way. So we're in this position now where, which is to say, just to really put a fine point on it, the bakery that I've grown in East Harlem, which services the cafe and then all of these wholesale clients, is staffed 50% by women who are currently going through the training program. So the training program is a 6-month paid on-the-job training program that happens in our 24-hour, 7-day-a-week bakery. And that model is amazing and it's really cool to visit, but that is not a model that's set up for profitability, especially in a field where the margins are so low. You know, that was the piece that like nobody really explained enough to me, and the business models didn't show in, you know, as clear a sense as I would have liked. But like we're working in the artisan bread space. Everything that we produce pretty much has to be eaten within 12 hours of production. And it's really hard to carve out margin in that. So I always say, like, if I were going to do another social enterprise, I would definitely do it in laundry or pest control or something where there's higher margin. And then I think getting to break even, whatever that means, would be easier. So that conflict, that challenge is something that for a while bugged me. And then at a certain point, and I should say, like, for a social enterprise, we have over the last 5 years funded the operation of the organization 65% through earned revenue, which is kitchen rental and bread sales. So it's aggressive for a nonprofit. But at some point, my board was like, the impact that we have on the lives of the people that come into both programs is so significant that they were like, what are we striving for? Why is that ultimately why is that an optimal objective? Like, we are a nonprofit. If we can raise the money, then do childcare. If we can raise more money, then get into education. Like, if you're doing it well and you're a high performing nonprofit, then like the objective of this elusive, like selling enough bread in a low margin business to cover all that training didn't make sense.
Yeah.
So it sort of has driven us in a very different direction to think about how growth and scale look.
I hear people ask all the time, why don't you just make it a business and then you can charge money and then you can be fully self-sustaining? And, you know, my answer is always the same, that you cannot use market solutions to solve market problems. If it were profitable to do a training program for low-income women at a bakery, Magnolia Bakery might have done it a long time ago, right? So I think it's important that we remember the role that philanthropy has to pay to fill that gap. And indeed, that is the gap that so many of us in the philanthropic space are filling. Charles, you have a different model. You had a very aggressive plan to be a fully self-sustaining organization. You raised millions of dollars early on, and you exceeded that goal, and now are a self-sustaining nonprofit. That's very unusual. Tell us a little bit about how you did that.
Sure. So if you give $10 to a classroom project on our site, you'll be encouraged, but you won't be required to allocate 15% of your donation to support our operating costs. And almost 90% of our donors keep that 15% allocation included when giving to a project. In our early years, Tony Yoseloff, who was also on our board during those formative years, he will remember discussions we had, hand-wringing, about the fact that we were spending about 50% of the money that we brought in on operating expenses, keeping the lights on. And so we were a long shot from being self-sustaining on 85, 90% of donors allocating 15% of their donations to support our operating costs. But we raised this round of funding, a $14 million round of funding in 2007, so that we could open our site to all the public schools in America. And we had this sort of promise, which was that with this $14 million of operating capital and the national expansion that it will make possible, we will be able to grow fast enough. There will be enough people giving to enough classroom projects, and including that 15% optional allocation enough of the time, that the income thus generated will pay all our bills. And we will hit that break-even point before the $14 million runs out. We were able to do that. In fact, there's our operating reserve is the $6 million from that $14 million round that we didn't have to spend because we hit break-even before needing to burn through it. So it's actually been now 9 years since we've had to ask anyone for help with the rent payment. We are still in the business of fundraising in that we absolutely sit down with philanthropists and foundations and companies. But our question is, what kinds of classroom projects best reflect your values and your strategy? And that is a much more fun conversation to have than here's our shortfall, will you please help us keep the lights on? So we feel really, really lucky. We're actually generating a surplus on the 15% optional allocation, and we put all of that surplus into matching donations to the first teachers using our site, their first projects. They're able to get donations matched. So it's not just self-sustaining, but even generating surplus that allows us to do more good things and to experiment.
Our other sister, who is not here tonight, was a kindergarten teacher and relied on Donors Choose to sustain the projects in her first year of teaching. So always will hold a special place in her heart. Cheryl, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about a subject that I know both you and I are both very passionate about, which is thinking about who's falling through the cracks in funding early stage organizations. And this is something that Echoing Green plays just an absolute critical role in the field in providing that seed capital. I don't know if people realize this, but if you want to start an organization, that is a huge luxury to say, I'm just going to take 6 months off and I'm gonna, forgo my my salary for a few months, and then I'm gonna just test out this idea that if you don't have the luxury of foregoing a salary for 6 months, you may have an idea that goes nowhere. And so, what I've seen in my research and all of these interviews that I've done is that so many of these stories start in the same way, that so-and-so graduated from Stanford and then came out and started her organization, or so-and-so graduated from Harvard and started his organization. And I love my students and I think they have amazing ideas. And I wonder if the field is really missing out on incredible talent that does not have those connections to funders, but that have incredible lived experience and connection to the communities that they are serving and are arguably in a better position to solve some of the social problems that we're talking about here. And so this is a very big question, but I know that Echoing Green has been doing fabulous work on trying to level the playing field, especially in this early stage. And I'd be just curious for you to talk a little bit about some of the work that Echoing Green has been doing to eliminate bias in early stage funding, and what you think the sector really needs to do to help level the playing field.
That's a biggie.
Boom!
And I'll try to get through it because it's critical. But before we move on, I want to just for those of you who may be starting something, always looking for resources. I went back and was reading sections of the book, Kathleen, and I think one of your findings about earned income and how some of these breakthrough social enterprises rely on earned income, like Charles and Jessamyn, is a really important finding. But you often, in articles that you've written, will reference a terrific article. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of Bridgespan, and one of the most widely read articles on SSIR is done by Peter Kim and William Foster, called 10 Funding Models, where they look at how some of the fastest growing nonprofits scaled. And there were sort of 10 different pathways towards that. So as a resource, I actually do read that article once or twice a year because it's a good reminder of how you think about your own funding model, because it is so very difficult to figure that out in our sector, especially in nonprofits where the beneficiary and customer are often different. So just for those, take a look at that article, super helpful. Okay, so bias in philanthropy, bias in the world. This is something that we think a lot about. And I know my colleague Camila Pasos. Camila, where are you? There's Camila, who runs our search and selection efforts for Echoing Green, and is really, I think, the sector's leading expert on doing search and selection work. I mean, we run through 2,500 business plans every year and ultimately select less than 2% of those who apply. But Camila and her team work all year to build the best-in-class system. And our mantra, if you walk around the office, is often that talent is equally distributed, opportunity is not. And it is the work of Echoing Green in many ways to make sure we are providing on-ramps for that talent that we know are in community, we know are proximate, who should get access to resources like Echoing Green. And just to give you a sense of the data, so we've started to track the folks who are coming across the transom through our search process. And when you look at our U.S.-based applicants, 55% of self-identified white applicants applied to us with funds already raised, compared with just 44% of self-identified Black applicants. This disparity applies to the amounts raised as well, whereas 31% of white applicants had raised funds of over $50,000. Compare that to only 14% of African-American applicants. You're really seeing sort of what we talk about as intersectionality, how race and gender collide, and create real structural inequities to really terrific early stage entrepreneurs. So we started interrogating the question, how will we at Echoing Green try to dismantle some of those barriers? And you truly make the road by walking. We are trying to learn and iterate every single day. And some of the things that Camila has really led the way on at Echoing Green to help eliminate bias from the system. So a couple years ago, for example, we implemented a blind review to our preliminary round of applicant review. So we conceal information from applicants, their name, their gender, educational pedigree, and current finances. And we really instead now focus in that initial round on judging the strength of the applicant's idea and the passion and motivation for why they do that work, recognizing that entrepreneurial success is very much predicated on passion. Why do you do what you do? It is an important indicator for potential success. So the blind review is super duper important. We've also layered in an additional level of applicant support. We pair every single fellowship finalist with an Echoing Green fellow to support them during the application and interview process. So it is all about the community lifting each other up, and it's been wonderful. And last but not least, under Camila's able leadership, we actually implemented bias training for all of the folks who evaluate our business plans. So important. So it's everything from the way we screen, the way we train, sort of the purview and the perspective that we bring to the work. And it really is making a difference. These, modifications were pretty much cost neutral for us. But the results really do speak for themselves. When you look at what happened after we implemented these changes, in 2017, our finalist pool included 61% leaders of color, applicants coming from 16 countries out of the U.S., and in a sector that is heavily male-dominated, sort of the entrepreneurial machismo that is endemic in this space. Those of us in the social innovation space had seen we've started to see a growing gender gap between male and female entrepreneurs. We're getting closer again to gender parity, and we were about 45% last year. So these measures and mechanisms do work, but you've got to commit to it and just fundamentally change the way you do the work.
Echoing Green really is a leader in this movement, and there's a lot of ways that you can support this by funding Echoing Green, of course.
Thank you.
But I think we also can, everybody in this room has donated to some cause, and I think we can all, even as individual donors, think about our role in helping to eliminate bias. How many nonprofits do we meet with who have a leader of color, and how can we do a better job of taking more meetings with leaders of color and funding more, even on an individual basis.
And can I just add, and you've talked about this a lot, Kathleen, and our colleague Kate Hayes is not here, but she runs our Direct Impact program, which is a board training program for young business leaders. And you shared the stat that 85% of the nonprofit boards are populated by white folks, and only 20% of the board members are under 40. No. Right. So we've got work to do. So how do you start to diversify boards, which is as important as diversifying the entrepreneurial bench? So all of these efforts are required for us to build these 21st century organizations.
Absolutely. I could talk about that issue all night.
Right.
One last bonus round question for you all, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. Even with the million projects, and certainly with the dozens of women that you're serving, this is obviously a small segment of the population that has a need for your services. How do you think about your end game? What is your ultimate goal, and why is your organization important in achieving that end game?
I'll jump in real quick. So for us, we would like to be put out of business when it comes to the roughly half of classroom project requests on our site that make you say, damn, I can't believe a teacher has to ask for dictionaries, or that an art teacher has to ask for art supplies, or that a English teacher has to ask for the core books that they need to teach. About half the projects on our site are just stark examples of inequity in our system, and the fact that students in low-income communities have access to fewer resources within the classroom than students in upper-income communities. But there's another half of projects on our site that go beyond what you would expect the taxpayer to underwrite. A field trip to Washington, D.C. to see the Supreme Court consider a case. A request for 2 underwater robot kits for students to solder and then deliver the native lake trout fry that they've been hatching in their classroom to a limestone reef in a nearby lake, and restore a native species and monitor with the second underwater robot whether the native lake trout fry are actually thriving in the limestone reef. And these are projects where private philanthropy is an appropriate mechanism for experimentation. So in any case, we'd like to be put out of business when it comes to those requests for really basic fundamental resources. And by opening up our data, we think we can actually bring the system a step closer to addressing that inequity and get to focus on experimental, kind of outside-the-box projects that teachers create and on pure innovation. In the meantime, to put a point on it, last school year, we generated about $125 million, $124 million of giving to classroom projects, which feels like a significant amount until you look at the $1.5 billion that public school teachers in the United States spent out of their own wallets on school supplies. So we are nibbling at the problem and really just trying to keep up with teachers creating projects on our site.
So the project that I'm involved in now is around scaling our training program and taking the core bakers and training program to other cities and train, and graduate 1,000 women a year into good jobs in the industry and grow a big bread business. And so that's kind of the end game of the nonprofit. But in the last 6 months, I feel like our work has taken on, in a way, a more significant role, as we all sort of watch with our jaws to the ground about, the disclosure around sexual violence and harassment in the industry. We are pushing and pipelining women into a very male-dominated industry. And I've never talked about the importance of those critical numbers from a safety lens, right? Like our mission and our work has always been around economic development. It's about helping women with talent get good jobs, and that is the mission. But all of a sudden, as I sit here in a position where I've been, creating, every year dozens of women, putting them into kitchens that are male dominated, and we've always said we're trying to change the gender of the industry. Well, all of a sudden I really feel like we need to do that faster, because until women are 50% represented in kitchen, and not just in front of house but in back of house, and not just in the back of house in the pastry kitchen but in the bakeries and on the lines, and really fully distributed in kitchens, then we can't even start to have the conversation about having promotion. We can't even talk about promotions. We really need to be talking at a base level around safety and security. So all of a sudden, I think there's this other impetus for the work that we do, which really has to do with changing and modeling how the industry should look and modeling good employment.
Cheryl, you have 3,000 applicants or more every year for 25 fellowships. So there is obviously much more need than you will ever be able to fill at Echoing Green. What's your end goal?
Again, I have been doing this work always through the lens of social justice, and I believe that sort of social movements are the most profound mechanism for scale. I just do. And sort of how do you get to large scale change? You change hearts and minds. And normative shifts change the world forever. So it's not about individual social innovators, as extraordinary as these two young folks are. It's about the collective impact, them as beacons and examples of how to show up in the world when you we've got two little cuties here, so I won't sort of make mention of, S-hole comments that denigrate people because of where they're from or what they look like. When we truly see one another and matter to one another, and that's not about an organizational form or earned income, that's just truly about the hard work, right? And so in many ways, I've loved being a part of the social innovation field, not because of the work that they do, as extraordinary as it is. It's how they show up in the world as fully formed human beings, where they've figured out a way to marry their passion and purpose. And in the way that athletes are in the zone, these folks are in the zone. And if we could all do that, whether we are wonderful second grade teachers or whether we're kicking butt as investment bankers, but thinking about triple bottom line plays or being terrific social innovators, that's the work that we have to do. So we sometimes, I think, sort of fetishize sort of the individual actor or the enterprise, but it's really much more about what is underneath that. So changing hearts and minds is ultimately what the work has to be about.
Well, on that inspiring note, let's take a couple of questions. Abby, do we have a microphone? Okay. Abby, do you want to go?
Hi, everyone. I'm Abby. Kathleen, so excited about your book. Haven't read it yet, but can't wait to. And thank you, everyone, for your comments. There have been several kind of quiet or corollary mentions about gender and motherhood on this panel. And I've been part of the founding team of 3 nonprofits and spent my career building startup nonprofits, as you know, Kathleen. And one place where I find scale to become a challenge is when you hit a point of like really creating real HR mechanisms, and specifically for women. Sorry, the microphone sounds like it's working now. Specifically for women. And so one question I have with respect to scale and thinking about women's safety, including economic safety, is how do you really scale when, startup organizations tend to have limited resources that they can invest in HR. And often when women need to have a baby, they get cut out of the equation. To what extent is that addressed in your book, and what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. Let's take a couple questions because I want to leave time for everyone to buy books. Yeah, right here.
Hey, thanks everyone for your time and insights. This has been wonderful. One of the things I've learned is that growth in an early enterprise of any kind is very rarely smooth and predictable. And it's so important to have those inflection points or those big breaks. And I'm interested to hear the 3 of you talk about what you felt like those were for the organizations you've built and what lessons you learned from that you would give to aspiring social entrepreneurs.
Okay, one more question and then we'll do a quick answer round.
Hi, I have an actual very technical question for Cheryl, and that's that you mentioned the bias training for evaluators, and I was curious if you could expand on that. Who did you use? What did that look like?
Great questions. Anyone want to start?
Would you use for bias?
Yep. Kayla, do you want to about how you think about the evaluator training that you do? Of course.
You have to focus on what the actual criteria that you are assessing for and make sure that the process allows for that criteria to shine. And so I think one of the first things that you do with bias is just acknowledge that we all have it. It's, one of the most universal things that makes us human. You guys, you know, make assumptions as you approach the world. And I think we've borrowed lessons that we've learned from fellows, from other social justice leaders who are basically saying that the more you acknowledge some of the interpretations that you make, the more you're conscious of them, the more you can then start saying, okay, well, how do I address a social entrepreneurship issue? How do I review this application question in a way where I'm not making my assessment based on bias? And so, to be punctual with what you asked, we developed a rubric. And so this rubric was designed so that our evaluators could mitigate subjectivity between their reviews. And this rubric was designed based exactly on what we asked applicants to write up in their application answers. And so when readers, so what we say to judges and we say to readers is, you know, when you're having reactions to application questions, ask yourself, you know, am I having a reaction because of what I'm reading, or am I just interpreting what I'm reading based on what I've learned and based on my own lived experience? And when you come to those moments where you don't know what that is, you know, use the rubric and use the sort of metrics that we've determined are the ones to sort of to measure what we want to see, what we as Echoing Green want to see in these early stage leaders.
Practices, breathing, sort of setting intentions, and it's been a fascinating journey for us. So you definitely check out Anu's work, Be More America.
I'll try a quick hit answering. So for Inflection Point, Oprah in 2003 discovered this experiment growing out of a Bronx classroom. She did an amazing segment and she crashed our site. And then after that, people from other...
Oprah is the answer.
Yes.
Always.
And then people from other parts of the country called up asking if DonorsChoose.org could expand to their cities and states, and that's really what got the ball rolling to national expansion. To your question about gender equity and whether it's tough for nonprofits that have lean budgets and are looking to grow really fast, it reminds me of how lucky we are at DonorsChoose.org that we are self-sustaining, and not just self-sustaining, but actually generate a bit of an operating surplus that we can do great things with. So for us, as an example, a colleague going on maternity leave does not loom as any kind of obstacle. I'll give you a second example. We're able to spend what will be about $250,000 this year on a fellowship program where we recruit the best and brightest students fresh out of college who meet one of three criteria. Either they are first in their family to have attended college, they qualified for Pell and TAP financial aid, which is to say they come from a low-income household, or they're an underrepresented minority. And this year we have 5 of those fellows, and it's just a direct, straight, like $250,000 investment in the diversification of our pipeline. It's one of several reasons why we're 1 percentage point away from half of our staff team being people of color. Fully half of our executive team is people of color. We have a straight line of sight for that even being the case on our board of directors. And I think I can't throw stones at orgs that aren't maybe hitting those goals, because we have this luxury of being self-sustaining and of being able to make financial investments in sort of equity and diversity within our organization, and it'd be a lot tougher for us if we weren't self-sustaining.
Great answers. Do you have anything to add before we close?
I'm an author, I get it.
Right, you're going to buy Kathleen's book, great things, but I have a whole bookcase of books like Social Startup Success, and I've highlighted literally every single word in Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and just sort of his experiences of starting a series of for-profit businesses, but it is transferable and translatable, and some of the challenges and pitfalls that you hit at inflection points and in early days when it's very much about hiring their particular stream of work, and once you grow, the level of complexity of the business, how you sort of hit some boundary turbulence there. I found it to be a wonderful resource.
Well,
and it's
a great
I know, I'm
book.
with you.
And I do think that having women in leadership roles at all these organizations is making such a difference, not only in terms of the policies that are put into place, in terms of the way we lead. I have a whole section in the book on collective leadership, and I don't think that that is by accident that it's happening at a time when we're seeing more and more women in these positions, that it's not about ego, it's not about taking credit. It's about figuring out how we can all work together, and that is ultimately what makes organizations more successful. Okay, I have to end there to leave time for everyone to buy books, and so I can sign your books. 3 ways that you can help support social startup success. One is to buy a book, and don't stop at just one. Buy them for your team, for your staff, for your boards, for your book group. I can get you discounts if you want to do multiple books. If you buy them here tonight, I'll sign them for you personally. 2, book me for a talk. For your tech company, your firm, your foundation, your nonprofit. I'm happy to come talk about social startup success and how your organization can do better, or how you can get your employees involved in social causes and volunteering. And 3rd is continue the conversation on social media, on news media. If you know anyone who wants to do a story about the book, come talk to me. and that's it. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. I wrote this book because I truly believe that we are living in a philanthropic renaissance, that all of us have the capacity to be a part of this movement to make the world a better place. And I hope that social startup success will give you the tools to do that. Thank you.